People don't talk about this stuff a whole lot, but it's interesting. When you actually press people on it, when you talk people about it, almost everybody knows that there's a big problem here that we haven't yet solved. People have different attitudes towards it. Some people say, well, gosh, we can't even begin to solve that one yet. We'll work on all these simpler problems first. Other people say, well, sure, there's a problem there, but it's not science anyway, gosh. I mean, it's subjective, it's not science, so we shouldn't need to worry about it. Some people deny there's a problem, but it's interesting. When you actually, I go around there, actually sometimes I do surveys, whether it's psychologists, neuroscientists, and philosophers. 3 out of 4 people say, gosh, there's a very serious problem here, which isn't being addressed by the current methods. What's interesting is, for the most part, people don't talk about it, and at least until very recently. And in recent years, people have actually started to talk about consciousness a little bit more centrally, and some of these problems are being brought directly into people's attention. And I think we're now entering into an exciting period where, for a long time, there's been a few little people here and there struggling away, making a little bit of progress, and little theories here and there on the problem. Now I think we're coming to a point where maybe we're going to see a more concerted effort for a number of people from different disciplines.
But at this point, at the end of the 20th century, it's probably fair to say that we don't have yet a scientific theory of consciousness.
I think that's absolutely correct.
The whole notion, which most people share, of some individual consciousness is a complete illusion.
I think so.
Here is part of an interview with the subject just before LSD is to be administered.
Having an experience of undivided consciousness does not tell you what consciousness really is, or what its relationship to the brain really is.
Earlier this century, for example, in psychology, there was the behaviorist movement that said to study the mind, all we're going to do is study behavior. All else is off limits. That allows the possibility, arguably, of an objective science of the mind, at cost, though, it seemed to many, of denying the most central phenomenon about the mind, the most central fact about the mind, which is that we are subjectively conscious. And psychology has gradually moved away from that. In philosophy, it's interesting. Even more recently in philosophy, there's been a big movement to say, well, as philosophers these days, we're not going to be caught up in those ancient mysteries. We're going to be scientific. We're going to try and, adapt our philosophy to the scientific worldview, and therefore we're going to deny any of these interesting, mysterious questions, which seem to lead us into the trap of being unscientific somehow. So, the movement of logical positivism, for example, in the 1940s, and philosophical behaviorism in the 1950s and 1960s. There was a groundswell towards just saying, okay, there's no problem here, it's all just a big semantic confusion. What's interesting, though, is actually in more recent years, I think, especially over the last 5 or 10 years, people have begun to realize, well, we almost convinced ourselves that there was no problem. Life was beginning to look a lot simpler, but the more you think about it, you realize, gosh, the problem just hasn't gone away. It's like that, that nagging itch. You can forget about for a while, and it comes back.
The leading proponent of reminding people that they haven't gotten rid of the problem. Some of the cognitive theorists have said, well, if we can solve all the little problems, and then you add that all up, that's it. That's consciousness.
I volunteer.
You feel you're normal?
I hope I'm normal. I think so.
I can assure you that you're a very stable and well-balanced person as a result of the test. Well, I think it's time for you to have your lysergic acid.
What is the one question you most want to see answered?
How does subjective consciousness work?
Everything is in color, and I can feel the air. I can see it. I can see all the molecules.
You can drop acid, you can meditate for a year, you can do whatever you want to perturb your nervous system. You can feel yourself to be one with the universe, and at no point in that transformation do you get a glimpse that there's 100 trillion neurons in your head, or synapses in your head that are doing anything.
I'm part of it. Can't you see it?
How does it evolve? What's going on?
Can you see it? It's right here in front of me, right now.
No, I can't quite see it. Tell me about it.
This is reality.
Dave, I've always been fascinated by the concept of existence, and when I think about existence, what that means, I'm always back to consciousness. But then I see some philosophers telling me that consciousness is an illusion, doesn't really exist. You think otherwise?
When I have my own private feelings and you have your own private feelings, what happens when I see something red? What is it that makes the redness? What is it that makes the smell of onions? What is it that gives the subjective sensation that I know I have and I suspect you have, but I can never know what's going on inside your head.
I think consciousness is the thing we know about more directly than we know about anything in the world. You know, the great philosopher Descartes said, we can doubt the existence of anything in the world. I could doubt that you exist. Maybe this is just a dream. I could doubt that any of the tables and chairs around us exist. I could maybe even doubt the existence of my own body. But the one thing I can't doubt is that I'm conscious right now. I think, I am conscious, therefore I am.
Why does mankind have that, inevitably? Because this part of our education, part of our culture, both religiously and worldly, that there is you as you are an individual, is one who is indivisible, but we're all broken up, so we can hardly call ourselves individuals.
My consciousness is presented to me more directly than anything else in the world. If this is an illusion, then the illusion is consciousness.
Descartes, who was really the father of dualism, he did a very interesting thing.
Some say, okay, that's Descartes, they ridicule him.
He said, first of all, only human beings had minds. Animals didn't have minds. They were just fancy clockwork.
They say now that we know about the brain, we know how the neurons work, the spikes of activity, the synapses, the chemical compositions, the complexity.
And we're a lot of fancy clockwork, too. There's lots of just mechanical processes going on in our body.
That out of that complexity of 100 billion neurons and trillions of connections, consciousness can emerge. Still an illusion.
But then in addition to those fancy processes, there's a special and, even to him, mysterious link to an immaterial mind.
Maybe consciousness emerges from something else. I mean, this is a further question downstream, but the number one datum of the science of consciousness and the philosophy of consciousness is there is consciousness. There is consciousness. Now, is it a primitive? Is it the first element of reality? Or is it something derivative? Is it sort of a second element of reality that somehow emerges from the brain? Well, that's an open question, at least at the beginning of the discussion. But you can't question that consciousness exists.
In fact, the only thing that he said couldn't be explained mechanically is what we're doing right now, having an intelligent conversation.
What are some of the methodologies that we can use, the contextual ways of thinking about the mind-body problem?
Well, I put forward a neutral way of thinking about the problem, saying, all right, so what is the problem? What are the data? Let's just have a catalog. And the data are what we do. Well, we can record that. We can use video and sound recording, and we can wire people up and get lots of data about what's going on in their brains and their bodies. And then we can talk to them about what they see and hear and feel and smell and so forth. I call this, by the way, heterophenomenology. This is phenomenology of the other, as opposed to autophenomenology, which is introspection, which is phenomenology of yourself.
Phenomenology being the things that we feel and sense. And
that's right, that's right.
Now, other people say, that's fine, Dan, but unless you do a first-person analysis, the internal, the auto, unless you do that, you're missing the fundamental core of consciousness.
Of course, but I'm saying when you introspect, you have to treat your own introspections with the same circumspection, the same caution that you treat everybody else's.
So what you're saying is that unless you can take that first-person experience and subject it to the third-person neutrality, it's not science.
That's right. Now, why should we do science then? I think most of the people who are interested in the mind-body problem accept that that is the mind-body problem. How can we unify our everyday, introspective, personal, first-personal sense of ourselves with the world that science tells us is there? I say there's a neutral way of doing it. You have to pass it through the third-person state.
And classically, the mind-body problem is something like this. How do you take atoms and molecules and physical substances that possess no consciousness whatsoever, and from that derive consciousness? That's the classic problem, as I understand it.
That's precisely it. How is it that all of this matter adds up to something as complex and as interesting and as unique somehow as consciousness? That works so well in so many other domains. The method of explanation by reduction, trying to explain, take a high-level phenomenon like life and reproduction and give an explanation of it in terms of low-level phenomena such as the molecular biology of DNA and how DNA transmits information, stores information, transmits it from one generation to the next, plays a role in the development of an organism. Eventually one gets a developing organism which grows and reproduces and adapts, and one gets a nice scientific explanation of life. That method works so well in so many domains. What's interesting is when it comes to applying that to consciousness, it seems to some extent we're banging our head against a brick wall. When it comes to some phenomena, such as the phenomena of explaining how it is, the objective phenomena of explaining how it is we react, and we talk, and we integrate information and so on, those problems, which I called earlier the easy problems, right, it seems that the kind of reductionist methods at least have some promise there. When it comes to the problem of explaining why all that physical stuff should be accompanied by a subjective experience, that seems as a different kind of question. It's what some philosophers have called an explanatory gap between the physical level and the level of consciousness. No number, 10 neurons, 100 neurons, 1,000 neurons, 1,000 billion neurons, no matter how complex, nothing in that story seems to tell you why it is that anything should ever have a subjective feeling to it.
Materialism says, at bottom, consciousness doesn't really exist. It's an illusion. Everything is material, third person. And that's obviously false because we know from each of our own cases, from our own experience, that consciousness exists. Now, dualism, which says, no, they're two separate and distinct realms, dualism is in worse shape in a way than materialism because it hardly gets up to the level of being false. It's incoherent. So I've suggested, look, forget about dualism, forget about materialism, and there's a way out of this conundrum.
All right, help me.
Okay, here's how it goes.
We don't have a great theory of the brain, but we have a pretty good theory, pretty good beginning theory.
We know about neurotransmission.
How neurotransmission works, how the different areas of the brain interact with each other, and what area does what, and rough principles of information processing that tells us what's responsible for vision, for language, and so on. Nothing in that has yet given us much insight into why that should be accompanied by subjective experience. And the interesting question, of course, is what it is we have to do, what it is we have to add to a theory.
Start off with what you know for a fact. Now, you know for a fact that you're conscious. Consciousness is real and irreducible. You can't get rid of it. Now, the second thing to remember, and this we've only come to know in the past couple centuries, all of my conscious states and all of your conscious states are caused by neuronal processes in the brain. And then third, consciousness is something that goes on in the brain. It is a feature or state or process going on in the brain. It's not mysterious. It is spatially localized. And finally, we know that conscious states actually function causally. So if you take those four, it's real and irreducible, caused by brain processes, exists in the brain, and functions causally, then your problem is not to have a puzzle about consciousness, but to show what was mistaken about these other views. The key to this whole approach that I'm urging is we have to think of consciousness as a biological phenomenon. It's as much a part of human and animal biology as digestion or photosynthesis or the secretion of bile or mitosis. We're talking about human biology here, human and animal biology. The main difference, at least at our present state of knowledge, is we have a better understanding of digestion than we do of consciousness. The brain is a tough nut to crack.
I think we have to make a really clear distinction between describing the character of one's experience and making claims about the way the cosmos is. And this is really where really any conversation about meditation and spirituality and science tends to go astray. I mean, I still use words like spiritual and mystical without furrowing my brow too much, and to the consternation of many atheists. I think there is a range of experience that is rare and that is only talked about without obvious qualms in religious discourse, and because it's only talked about in religious discourse, it is just riddled with superstition, and it's used to cash out various metaphysical schemes which it can't reasonably do. But clearly people have extraordinary experiences, whether they have them on LSD, or they have them because they were alone in a cave for a year, or they have them because they just happen to have the neurology that is particularly labile that allows for it. But people have self-transcending experiences, and people have the best day of their life where everything seemed, they seemed at one with nature. Sure. And for that, because religion seems to be the only game in town in talking about those experiences and dignifying them, that's one reason why I think it seems to be taboo to criticize it, because you're talking about the most important moments in people's lives and trashing them, at least from their view.
As you say, religion is not the only game in town when it comes to being spiritual. It's like it's a good idea to have somebody from the political right who is an atheist, because otherwise there's a confusion of values.
If one could make one change and only one, mine would be to distinguish the numinous from the supernatural.
Yes.
Right. People, in a sense, won't trust their own valuing of their numinous experiences. They think it isn't really as good as it seems unless it's from God, unless it's in some kind of a proof of religion. No, Right. it's just as wonderful as it seems. It's just as important. It is the best moment in your life.
I wonder, sir, what you mean by that word lucid. I wonder whether you mean clarity.
That's what first comes to mind.
Yeah. Is this clarity a matter of intellectual perception, or is it a perception with your whole being, not merely a fragment of your being, but with the totality of one's own being?
Certainly has the ring of the latter. It's the latter.
So it is not fragmentary. Therefore, it's not intellectual or emotional or sentimental. And so, is it possible in this confused world with so many contradictions and such misery and starvation, not only outwardly but also inwardly, such insufficiency psychologically, outwardly there are so many rich societies, is it at all possible for a human being living in this world to find within himself a clarity that is constant, that is true in the sense, not contradictory? Is it possible for a human being to find it?
That's my question.
Your question. I don't see why not.
You have someone like Deepak Chopra, who is for all intents and purposes, a pseudoscientist and a charlatan.
I believe there's a transcendent core consciousness that is comprised of meanings, context, relationships, archetypal ideas that recycles itself, just like everything else recycles itself.
So it's in no sense a product of the brain.
It's no sense a product of the brain, and our whole endeavor in spiritual discipline is to actually go beyond that personal consciousness, that ego consciousness, so we can identify with that transcendent reality, which is the source of space, time, energy, and everything else that exists.
Okay, he makes legitimate claims about the character of the experience of meditation. I mean, it's possible to feel that you're one with the universe and to lose your sense of boundary with the universe. It's possible to have really wonderful oceanic experiences of consciousness, or experiences that seem like just pure consciousness, where sense data fall away and it just seems like you are consciousness prior to anything else showing up in terms of the character of your experience.
When you're looking at the brain for consciousness, you're not looking at consciousness, you're looking at synaptic firings. In fact, it is your consciousness that is looking at those synaptic firings.
Having an experience of undivided consciousness does not tell you what consciousness really is or what its relationship to the brain really is. There's nothing about introspection that leads you to sense that your subjectivity is at all dependent or even related to voltage changes and chemical interactions going on inside your head.
I wish I could talk in Technicolor. I can't tell you about it. If you can't see it, then you'll just never know. I feel sorry for you.
Okay, you can feel, you can drop acid, you can meditate for a year, you can do whatever you want to perturb your nervous system. You can feel yourself to be one with the universe, and at no point in that transformation do you get a glimpse that there's 100 trillion neurons in your head, or synapses in your head that are doing anything.
It's called binding.
No, it's not. It's called absolute subjective ignorance of what's actually going on outside your consciousness. There's nothing more important than subjectivity. It's all we could possibly care about. they have some relation to the physical universe.
Absolutely.
Okay, now the question
they give
is,
rise to the physical universe.
Because that is a statement of metaphysics that is totally unjustified and cannot possibly be
That's
justified.
why it's a statement of metaphysics, not of
on-
physics.
No, metaphysical statements also have to be justified, as it turns out.
Metaphysics statements come from subjective experiences.
But someone like Deepak then moves from those experiences to making claims about consciousness giving birth to the universe, that we are the one mind that in which the universe is arising, metaphysical and even physical claims for which there is no warrant. And so you have to be very slow to extrapolate from what you experience in the darkness of your closed eyes to what is true of the nature of the universe.
Science doesn't actually give a theory of the conscious feeling of hotness. So science is actually built up on the idea that one has to eradicate the subjective to give these objective theories. If so, then when it comes to that works for a lot of phenomena. When it comes to giving a theory of consciousness itself, which is the paradigmatically subjective phenomenon, it seems that it may be that the methods of science have to be expanded.
A philosopher entertainer from the 60s and 70s who was a big hit in California and a kind of a much needed figure now in society with there being such a schism between religion and science. What is there to bridge the gap?
My position as a philosopher is not a verbal position. My position as a philosopher is experiential, and not existential, experiential. That is to say, the experience of the ground.
We are functioning physically not as separate entities, but as beings that live in such a close relationship with everything else that there really is no way of dividing us from it. And so you see the mystic in all times and places discovers the illusory nature of this ego and realizes with a glorious shock that the true I, myself, the thing that one really is fundamentally, is the entire game, the works. Some people call it God, or Brahman, or the Tao, or whatever you want. The name doesn't make the slightest difference. Anyway, that fundamentally what you are is the which than which there is no whicher. And so relax, don't worry. Because you don't, you see, this doesn't ordinarily come into consciousness in just the same way that the structure of your brain doesn't ordinarily come into consciousness. It's very much there.
There's nothing about introspection that leads you to sense that your subjectivity is at all dependent or even related to voltage changes and chemical interactions going on inside your head.
In just the same way that the structure of your brain doesn't ordinarily come into consciousness. It's very much there. But you don't see it directly and you have no memory of it. So in the same way, you have no memory of being the which in which there is no whicher. But there's no need to have a memory of that, because the thing doesn't need a memory. Memories are only necessary for creatures that have to defend themselves. And to creatures that have problems, they need memories. But the perfectly gloriously happy person wouldn't remember anything, because every experience would be completely satisfactory. All memory is really a form of regurgitation of undigested experience. But you see, also, don't forget, as we all know, memory can be fun, and so can burping. And but memory isn't necessary for the whole thing, except in certain brief forms of memory, where the continuance of anything at all, you see, of any particular form, is a sort of memory, in the sense that it's a repeated gyration of certain physical vibrations. But it's possible, you see, to wake up and realize that your ego is a game.
I think we have to make a really clear distinction between describing the character of one's experience and making claims about the way the cosmos is.
That's why it's a statement of metaphysics, not of physics.
No. Metaphysical statements also have to be justified, as it turns out.
Metaphysics statements come from subjective experiences.
A lot of people say that their approach to life is scientific, as distinct from metaphysical, and that metaphysics is bosh, anyway. But everybody, by virtue of being a human being, is willy-nilly a metaphysician. That is to say, everybody starts from certain fundamental assumptions as to what is the good life, what he wants, what are his, shall we say, axioms for living. And I find that psychologists tend to be blind to these fundamental assumptions.
Almost every science student will learn that we have heat sensors that are part of our nervous system. They become activated. They send neural impulses up from the sensor along the nerves into the brain, and therefore we feel or perceive that heat. You're saying that doesn't really explain it.
Well, I think that you can tell a nice scientific story about what happens when the stuff in the environment hits the heat sensors. It sends a story up the optic nerve, and something happens in the brain, and some neurons wiggle up there, and so on. And then you said, the last step, and therefore we feel it. Now that's the interesting step. How does that happen? How do those neurons firing and wiggling away inside the brain suddenly give rise to this subjective experience of hotness, the feeling of heat? Nothing in the scientific story, it seems, tells you why that has to happen. How does the water of the brain turn into the wine of consciousness?
Maybe it's truer of psychiatrists than it is of psychologists, but...
As far as everything in the scientific story is concerned, consciousness might as well not be there, it seems, from the third-person point of view. We might as well just be giant, unconscious automata, zombies, functioning in the world, reacting to those heat sensors, giving little reports like, gosh, that's hot, reacting to it, sweating a little bit maybe and moving away. Why do we need conscious subjective experience in that picture?
They tend to feel that they are scientists. They're rather bending over backwards to have a scientific status, because that, of course, is fashionable in our age. But it's so amusing that when, say, let's take psychoanalysis, for example, as pointed out to many philosophers, that their philosophical ideas are capable of being shown to have a psychoanalytic reference. For example, John Wisdom wrote a book about the philosophy of Berkeley, in which he attributed a great deal of his point of view to his experiences in toilet training as a child. The philosopher is very grateful to the psychoanalyst for revealing to him his unconscious and its emotional contents. But the psychoanalyst must in turn await a revelation from the philosopher as to his philosophical unconscious and the unexamined assumptions which lie in it. So, if I may start by insulting your intelligence with what is called the most elementary lesson, the thing that we should have learned before we learned 1, 2, 3 and ABC, but somehow was overlooked. Now, this lesson is quite simply this, that any experience that we have through our senses, whether of sound or of light or of touch, is a vibration. And a vibration has two aspects, one called on and the other called off. Vibration seems to be propagated in waves, and every wave system has crests and it has troughs. And so life is a system of now you see it, now you don't. And these two aspects always go together. For example, sound is not pure sound. It is a rapid alternation of sound and silence. And that's simply the way things are. Only you must remember that the crest and the trough of a wave are inseparable. Nobody ever saw crests without troughs or troughs without crests, just as you don't encounter in life people with fronts but no backs. Just as you don't encounter a coin that has the heads but no tails. And although the heads and the tails, the fronts and the backs, the positives and the negatives are different, they're at the same time one. And one has to get used fundamentally to the notion that different things can be inseparable. That what is explicitly two can at the same time be implicitly one. If you forget that, very funny things happen. If therefore we forget, you see, that black and white are inseparable, and that existence is constituted equivalently by being and non-being, then we get scared. And we have to play a game called, uh-oh, black might win. And once we get into the fear that black, the negative side, might win, we are compelled to play the game, but white must win. And from that start all our troubles. Because you see, the human awareness is a very odd mechanism. I don't think mechanism is quite the right word, but it'll do for the moment. That is to say, we have as a species specialized in a certain kind of awareness, which we call conscious attention. And by this we have the faculty of examining the details of life very closely. We can restrict our gaze, and it corresponds somewhat to the peripheral field, the central field of vision in the eyes. We have central vision, we have peripheral vision. Central vision is that which we use for reading, for all sorts of close work, and it's like using a spotlight, whereas peripheral vision is more like using a floodlight. Now, civilization and civilized human beings for maybe 5,000 years, maybe much longer, have learned to specialize in concentrated attention. Even if a person's attention span is short, he is, as it were, wavering his spotlight over many fields. The price which we pay for specialization in conscious attention is ignorance of everything outside its field. I would rather say ignorance than ignorance, because if you concentrate on a figure, you tend to ignore the background. You tend, therefore, to see the world in a disintegrated aspect. You take separate things and events seriously, imagining that these really do exist, when actually they have the same kind of existence as an individual's interpretation of a Rorschach plot. They're what you make out of it. In fact, our physical world is a system of inseparable differences. Everything exists with everything else. But we contrive not to notice that, because what we notice is what is noteworthy. And we notice it in terms of notation. Numbers, words, images. What is notable, noteworthy, notated, noticed, is what appears to us to be significant, and the rest is ignored as insignificant. And as a result of that, we select from the total input that goes to our senses only a very small fraction. And this causes us to believe that we are separate beings, isolated by the boundary of the epidermis from the rest of the world. And you see, this is also the mechanism involved in not noticing that black and white go together. Not noticing that every inside has an outside, and that the inside, what's inside, goes on inside your skin, is inseparable from what goes on outside your skin. Do you see that, for example, in the science of ecology, one learns that a human being is not an organism in an environment, but is an organism-environment. That is to say, a unified field of behavior. If you describe carefully the behavior of any organism, you cannot do so without at the same time describing the behavior of the environment. And by that you know that you've got a new entity of study. You are describing the behavior of a unified field. But you must be very careful indeed not to fall into old Newtonian assumptions about the billiard ball nature of the universe. The organism is not the puppet of the environment, being pushed around by it. Nor, on the other hand, is the environment the puppet of the organism, being pushed around by the organism. The relationship between them is, to use John Dewey's word, transactional. A transaction being a situation like buying and selling, in which there is no buying unless somebody sells and no selling unless somebody buys. So that fundamental relationship between ourselves and the world, which is in an old-fashioned way by people such as Skinner, who have not updated his philosophy, interpreted in terms of Newtonian mechanics. He interprets the organism as something determined by the total environment. And he doesn't see that in a more modern way of talking about it, we're simply describing a unified field of behavior, which is nothing more than what any mystic ever said.
You have someone like Deepak Chopra, who is for all intents and purposes, a pseudoscientist and a charlatan.
I believe there's a transcendent core consciousness that is comprised of meanings, contexts, relationships, archetypal ideas that recycles itself, just like everything else recycles itself.
That's a dirty word in the modern academic scientific environment. But if a mystic is one who is sensibly or even sensuously aware of his inseparability as an individual from the total existing universe, he is simply a person who has become sensible, aware through his senses of the way ecologists see the world. So when I'm in academic circles, I don't talk about mystical experience. I talk about ecological awareness. Same thing. And so the next aspect of our metaphysical introduction must be about games.
So I hang out with Buddha and Krishna and, all those guys.
Are you a
Buddhist? I'm a Buddhist, I'm a Muslim, I'm a Christian, I'm whatever you want me to be. It all comes down to the same thing. You're in a loving place or you're in an unloving place. If you're with me right now, we cannot be unhappy. It's not possible. It's not possible. Just try.
Would you be offended if I said I'd like to be a little drier?
His faith is personal and mystical. Personal and mystical.
Having an experience of undivided consciousness does not tell you what consciousness really is or what its relationship with the brain really is. There's nothing about introspection that leads you to sense that your subjectivity is at all dependent or even related to voltage changes and chemical interactions going on inside your head.
The construction of my brain is not contained in the concept Alan Watts, and the concept Alan Watts does not contain the inseparable relationships which I have with all the rest of the universe. And therefore that concept is a fraud.
So you don't need the same body. You go where the memories, say, go. And that was the view of the Enlightenment philosopher John Locke. He thought that memory was the key so far as personal identity is concerned.
But you don't see it directly and you have no memory of it. So in the same way, you have no memory of being the witch in which there is no witcher, but there's no need to have a memory of that.
But you can have a case where, I have some kind of a disease or a tumor in my hippocampus in my brain, and suddenly I lose my ability to make short-term memory. Maybe there could be some other damage that could cause long-term memory. I could be amnesic. And I would still have this inner awareness that is the same. I just wouldn't know who I was, or I wouldn't know who my family was. But I would still be persisting as a person without memory. So now I've gotten rid of my memory, but you wouldn't say that I'm not the same person.
because the thing doesn't need a memory.
No, but then there would still be a great many psychological attributes that would remain unchanged. I mean, there would be your various personality traits, for example. You might still be, you know, your desires and so on. They may remain entirely unchanged. So those who go with psychological continuity as the relevant criterion tend to broaden things out from just memory in order to accommodate that kind of possibility, for example, where somebody might more or less entirely lose their memory.
Memories are only necessary for creatures that have to defend themselves.
Yeah,
so we could deal with that case in that way.
And to creatures that have problems, they need memories. But memory isn't necessary for the whole thing, except in certain brief forms of memory, where the continuance of anything at all, you see, of any particular form is a sort of memory, in the sense that it's a repeated gyration of certain physical vibrations.
You probably, though, can go through every psychological characteristic and change any one of them. I mean, sometimes I'm very irascible. And that may not seem like me, but indeed is part of me.
All memory is really a form of regurgitation of undigested experience.
Really, this is the totality, and it's not like a step function difference. You have this rounded picture, and all are pieces of the persistence of this person.
But the perfectly gloriously happy person wouldn't remember anything, because every experience would be completely satisfactory. But you see, also, don't forget, as we all know, memory can be fun, and so can burping.
Yeah, we could use we could borrow an analogy from Wittgenstein and talk about maybe a rope, which could be strong, thick rope, but its strength doesn't consist in the fact that there's a single thread that runs from one end to the other. You have a series of overlapping threads, and that's enough to have a single rope that's strong. And so similarly with these personality traits,
and you could lose some of the string and it would get a little bit weaker.
Yeah. In fact, you may not have any of the same strands hanging out of this end that you've got hanging out of that end, but it's still the same rope, you see. So the psychological continuity view allows for that kind of psychological change, pretty dramatic psychological change. So psychological continuity looks pretty strong. You can deal with the brain swap type cases, but of course you then run into other difficulties.
The echo, which is memory, is simultaneously what tells you you exist and what traps you. So in the sense that it tells you you exist, it's an advantage. To the extent that it traps you, it's a debt. You're in debt. You should be thankful. Somebody gave it to you. Ultimately, in the Judeo-Christian tradition, the Lord God did it all for you, and you should be thankful. What a marvelous mix-up that is.
It's the question is, why should we think objective value must be on the cosmic scale or not there at all? Why not believe that moral reasons outweigh prudential reasons? The mere fact that there's a conflict doesn't commit the naturalist to the claim that the prudential ones are the weightier ones.
All right, but there is that conflict, and for many people, I think, as I said, this can have a demoralizing effect upon a person. Because
no doubt for some people it will be, but of course for some people, there's a different kind of demoralizing that takes place with the belief in theism, isn't there? I mean, if we're just going to talk about what are some possible psychological effects, some people will act morally not out of the recognition of the objective values, but merely in hopes of getting into heaven and avoiding hell. There's something morally off about that as well. So both sides face certain empirical questions about, certain people may misread the implications of the view. That strikes me as a standoff at best.
I don't know.
But all I'm saying is this: there is a point in all this development where you have to say to people, please come off it. So I'm talking, you see, about the same process of what has been called flip-flopability, whereby we switch from one attitude to another, one situation to another,
And this pulse switch situation is the very nature of existence. That's why your heart does that. That's why all sounds, all light, everything is going bloop, 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 bloop. See? And so, because of that bloop, you know you're here. Every man thinks of this world as a collection of objects. The world is a lot of things, and each person considers himself as a thing.
Hi.
How you doing?
I called in to talk about this whole debate about the existence of the soul.
What's the mechanism? For example, if there's a soul that is you, that is unharmed, unchanging, and it's working through this brain. If we perform, let's say, a hemispherectomy on the brain, do we create a second soul, or do we just copy the soul? I mean, because you can end up with two distinct personalities, two different things doing this.
Yeah.
And I wonder if you've ever stopped to ask yourself what a thing is.
Personal identity, numeric personal identity, and that is basically the distinction between you and me as, separate things, although we are composed of the same things and we have similar functions in our brain.
And why you think you are a thing. Are you quite sure that you are a thing? Because if we take a look at ourselves from another point of view, for example like this, we shall find that we are not one thing at all. We're an extraordinary number of things. For what you're looking at there is the cell structure of your own body. A whole multitude of tiny, tiny little individuals. We might ask again, what other points of view could we take to ourselves? We could, of course, take the sociologist's point of view, where we're not really a thing at all, but a sub-member of a group. Or still more, if a man visiting us from another planet in something like a flying saucer were to hover down and look at what sort of creature is inhabiting this Earth, what would he see? Let's take a look and get some idea of his view. This is the kind of creature he would find inhabiting this planet. A sprawly, nubbly thing with various lines connecting bits of it. That would be, in his view, the kind of thing that we are. For you see, how many things we are depends upon the point of view which one takes. Every point of view that we've taken, the point of view of the cells, the point of view of the man hovering above the Earth in a flying saucer or an aeroplane, is a correct point of view. And according to the way in which we look, so we divide the things of the world. It's interesting, isn't it, that the word thing is very like the word think. Because by breaking down our world into things is the way in which we think about it.
Logical atomist, but very keen on the label. I've rather avoided labels. What does it mean, a logical atomist? It means, in my mind, that the way to get at the nature of any subject matter you're looking at is analysis. And that you can analyze until you get to things that can't be analyzed any further. And those would be logical atoms. I call them logical atoms because they're not little bits of matter. They're the, so to speak, ideas out of which a thing is built up.
We break down what we call the material world into objects and assign to those objects the kind of words we describe as nouns. And then the world of action we break into events and assign to events the kind of word we call verbs. But things and events are fundamentally the ways of breaking up our complex world so that we can think about it. And therefore that concept is a fraud. And when it's mistaken for the real me, there's a confusion. Because if somebody says to me, Alan Watts, do something about it, the concept Alan Watts can't do anything. In other words, because it's only a concept, you can't make it lift a weight, just as 3 is a concept. 3, the number. You can't make just plain 3 do anything. So also you can't wrap up parcels with the equator. It's a useful imaginary line, but it can't do anything.
So does the thought create the molecule, or the molecule create the thought? Or are they simultaneous expressions of a deeper, transcendent reality that we are inseparable?
First of all, science is a method of description.
But what we do in science is we try to approach it objectively. We try to set our research studies so that the evidence tells us what's going on, and we don't inject our opinions.
If we describe this particular form poetically, as distinct from exactly, we might say, well, it's like a flame dancing above the fire, burning gas, or something of that kind. But the interest of science is to describe these forms very precisely indeed. And to do so, it employs a method which is fundamentally like this: to superimpose over the form some very simple, regular pattern in terms of which the form can be described. And what we see here is a system of squares which can be described accurately because they can be numbered up and down. And if we were, for example, to fill in the light gray area the squares over which the form passes, we should get a rather rough but still approximate formal equivalent of the original figure. But you notice in the top left-hand corner of the screen, putting things in boxes.
The nucleus of a carbon-14 atom is unstable. At some time, this unstable nucleus will emit a high-energy electron called a beta particle, which has a 1- charge. How old is the artifact? The level of 12.4% indicates that 3 half-lives have passed.
Basically, this is the act of classification, of representing the complex forms of the world in terms of simpler, regular forms that we can understand.
The spheres of hydration that form around the ions keep them suspended in the fluid.
Science is the art of definition.
There's antimony, arsenic, aluminum, selenium, and hydrogen, and oxygen, and nitrogen, and rhenium, and nickel, neodymium, neptunium, germanium, and iron, americium, ruthenium, uranium, europium, zirconium, lutetium, vanadium, and lanthanum, and osmium, and astatine, and radium.
Of getting things down, as we say, in black and white. Of assimilating the unknown, the irregular, and the wayward to patterns that are known, regular, and controlled. And basically, this is really the whole operation of that distinctively human activity that we call thought. Because thought is fundamentally classification.
And gold, protactinium, and indium, and gallium, and iodine, and thorium, and thulium, and thallium.
And so also science is classification. If you read older works of science, works of, say, natural history and zoology, you will see that the primary concern of the scientist was to classify the various species of nature, the various types of butterflies and insects, the various forms of rocks, the various varieties of plants, and to get them all into classes, like animal, vegetable, mineral, and all their innumerable subdivisions. And so, thought fundamentally asks of classes, is a given natural phenomenon in that class, or is it not in it?
So, to have clarity, the first essential thing is freedom. Freedom from authority.
And I feel in a kind of bind because this freedom is attractive too, and I want to go towards that. But I also want to pick your mind and ask you how to proceed. Am I moving away from my freedom if I ask you how to proceed?
No, sir, but I'm pointing out the difficulty of that word, the implication of that word, the how.
We've discussed, you see, we started out at the very beginning with solid emptiness, which was the Madhyamika doctrine of the complete letting go of all opinions, of every kind of psychological and intellectual and spiritual security, because there's nothing you can grasp.
The word how implies intrinsically a mind that says, please tell me what to do.
Is that a wrong question?
I should think that's a wrong question. They have the obstructions that prevent clarity, then we can go into it. But if you say right from the beginning there, please, what is the method? There have been dozen methods, and they've all failed. They have not produced clarity or enlightenment or a state of peace in man. On the contrary, these methods have divided man. You have your method and somebody else has his method, and these methods are everlastingly quarreling with each other.
Are you saying that once you abstract certain principles and formulate them into a method, this becomes too crude?
That's right.
The intricacies,
the intricacies and the complexities and the living quality of clarity.
So that the how must always be immediate from where one stands, the particular individual.
I would never put the how at all. The how should never enter into the mind.
Well, this is a hard teaching. It may be true, and I'm reaching for it, and yet I don't know that it's possible. I don't feel that it's possible completely to relinquish the question how and...
We next went on to the Vignapti Matra school, which is that everything is in your mind. And I showed you the difference between that and Western subjective idealism.
If we could go a little slowly, not into the how, but what are the things that prevent clarity? Through negation, come to clarity, not through the positive method of following a system.
That mind means something different in the Orient than it does in the West, because matter means something different. Matter in the Orient means form, shape, outline, structure, rupa in Sanskrit. And so mind means not the opposite of matter, exactly, but in a way, what we would call the most material thing there is. And so the diamond is used as the image of the mind, because the diamond is harder than all other materials and can cut everything else, and is completely transparent.
Divide himself, his loyalties, his pursuits. You have the how of yours and the how of somebody else and the method of this and they're all lost. Via negativa.
Approach to the back door, that's good.
I think that's the only way.
All right.
The positive way of the how has led man to divide.
So this is their image of the mind, whereas our image of the mind tends to be the opposite of the material, to be, instead of hard, something that you can wave through like air. Their image of the mind is the diamond. And then we've gone on from that point to see the Avatangsaka philosophy of the complete interdependence of all things in the universe. That is to say, that from any grain of dust you can reconstruct the whole universe. Because any given grain of dust, every discarded nose picking, every hair on a mosquito's wing, anything you can think of, exists only in context with everything else. So that you could, if you knew enough, reconstruct the whole universe from this discarded nose picking or whatever it was. See? That's called Jiji Muge.
And perhaps you'd like to conclude this discussion by saying a little about
the complete interdependence of everything. Now, as far as I can see, the basic mistake is that we've invented this wonderful system of language and calculation.
The laws of physics are mostly equations, things like Maxwell's equations describing electric and magnetic fields, Einstein's equations describing gravity.
And that it is at once too simple to deal with the complexity of the world.
It's so simple, these equations. I mean, mathematics can be hard, but they're simple in terms of they're small.
That we've invented this wonderful system, wonderful system.
So those are they're definitely laws, but they are not in the same category. They are some sort of abstraction arising out of a whole multitude of facts.
And also, we are liable to confuse that system of symbols with the world itself, just as we confuse, say, money with wealth.
We have Grant Cardone here. He is a New York Times bestselling author and the founder of Cardone Enterprises, among other companies. Grant, could you tell us the latest title of your article?
How to Become a Millionaire by 30, guaranteed.
A lot of people are in business to make money instead of wealth. When they make the money, they don't know what to do with it.
Now, could you basically tell the Entrepreneur.com reader other tips that are directly related to growing their wealth and success in millions of dollars, their wealth and success?
Like, you know, be greedy, like want it so bad, be obsessed about it, demand it, make it a priority so that you can have what you want in life.
So when you look at the bigger picture, greed is actually good. All right, thanks, Grant.
And so in the same way, we confuse happiness with status, and we confuse ourselves as living organisms which are one with this whole universe, with something we call our personality.
If we perform, let's say, a hemispherectomy on the brain, do we create a second soul, or do we just copy the soul? Because you can end up with two distinct personalities, two different things doing this.
Now, what is our personality? Our personality is what we call our image of ourselves, and also our thought about ourselves, our idea of ourselves. This is the person. In other words, what people meet and understand, and what I understand as Alan Watts, is a big act which is not really me.
A new consciousness is developing which sees the Earth as a single organism and recognizes that an organism at war with itself is doomed. We are one planet.
Now, I'm standing up here trying to reason with you, and you'll think, he looks a little like Ben Stiller.
And I think we all sort of walked away with an incredible feeling of shame.
Crazy to think about, and that's when we all have to kind of walk away and you know, stick our heads in the water and just kind of shake them out and then say, wait a minute, you know, what time is it, and where do I go to get lunch? I'm gonna go get a bagel.
Yeah.
You want something?
No, I'm good, Tom.
All right, okay.
I'm good.
All right,
All right,
okay. We've worked together for so long now, it's almost like, I don't know, it's kind of like we almost finish each other's sentences, kind of.
I mean, I don't think we've ever finished each other's sentences.
Career to prove it. But he does think that people who express strong feelings about spirituality run the risk of being labeled a kook. You know, what the hell? What the hell? You know, whatever. I just want to be myself.
So if you give complete attention to the image that you have about yourself, attention, not concentration, give attention, then you will see the image has no meaning, it disappears.
Empty your mind. Be formless, shapeless, like water. Now you put water into a cup, it becomes the cup. You put water into a bottle, it becomes the bottle. You put it in a teapot, it becomes the teapot. Now water can flow, or it can crash. Be water, my friend. Like that, you see?
I see, I get the...
Where was you when you were laughing? What is you now?